This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The other day I asked you over on Instagram what your most burning questions and biggest struggles are with photo editing. Many of you replied, so thank you for that, otherwise this video would not exist. But instead of replying to each individual question, I grouped them by theme. Some were about how to get the film look, or what I prefer to call the organic natural look. There were also many about colors and color grading and tonality. Others were centered on exposure and how to use the basic settings based on the lighting conditions. So with a little bit of brain power, I managed to allocate all the questions into 6 different themes. So while I won't reply to each question separately, I think most of them will be answered by the end of the video. Before jumping in and before I forget, I'm running a big sale on my store for 1 week from the day I post this video. 30% off my presets and Lightroom editing course. There's no code required. The link is in the description. And now let's go over the first theme, which is all about the film/organic look. By the way, I prefer and I will refer to it as the organic look because I don't think my photos are an attempt at replicating the film look, but they definitely have some attributes from analog photos. The first step is to analyze and understand film photos correctly before trying to mimic them or take some characteristics from them. If we start by looking at the colors, most film stock will have their own identity, Kodak Gold being warmer than Portra and Kodak generally warmer than Fujifilm film stocks, for example. But what most of these have in common is natural looking individual colors. Greens are green, yellows are yellow, and reds are red. There's just slightly different shade, but there are not dramatic shifts between all of them. So where they differ is more on the white balance and the overall color grading, if we can say so. So the thing to understand is that editing your photos in a very cinematic, maybe teal and orange look will just go against that principle. For example, I have this preset I called Cinematic that I use on very rare occasions, mostly at night, blue hour, or when the scenes call for it. But let's have a look to it. The greens are very desaturated, leaning more towards yellow, and the reds toward orange, trying to blend colors together to have a smaller color palette, which is characteristic of some modern movies. This goes totally against the organic look, where you should still be able to differentiate all the individual colors. For example, my most used preset, Classic from V3, has a lot going on in the HSL and the calibration tool to have the best blend of color, but each colors are still fully separated. The changes in the hue section are contained within ±10, with just the reds at +20. And then when it comes to the color grading, I think that the best results and the more film-like results will be obtained when you keep everything below 3 different shades, because putting red in the shadow, green in the midtones, and blue in the highlights can be just too much and overwhelming, with all tonal ranges just fighting each other too much. Generally, I like to keep all my color grading wheels within 2 opposite directions. For example, it can be teal in the shadows, orange in the midtones, and yellow in the highlights. I have this example where I went overboard, but it just serves as an example. I have one version with all 3 tones at different directions. It looks ugly. And another one where I only kept 2 directions, and it already looks much better. It just pushed too much and too saturated, but you get the point. Then the second important aspect of the organic look is contrast. Again, if we really think about film, contrast will depend on how you shot the photo. Correct exposure or overexposed by 1 or 2 stops will have very different results, despite both being shot on film. I personally prefer the overexposed look, so a slightly lower contrast with more brightness from the shadow areas. I usually achieve that by boosting my blacks a hefty amount, supported by a touch also in the shadows, and I prefer giving priority to the blacks to get this more organic feel and avoid any HDR-ish look. And the last important characteristic of this organic look is the white and black point. This happens in the tone curve when you edit your photos. Film tend to have a higher black point, a bit of a fade if we say it differently, but I personally prefer a black point at 0 with a bit of true blacks in my photos. But on the other end, with the whites, I always bring them down a decent amount, trying to make that last bit of curve in the highlight section quite smooth to have a nice highlight roll-off. And what I also do in the parametric curve is making that last section quite small, and I bring it down a bit to even accentuate this matte looking finish to my photos. So to complement this organic look, what I do is bringing down the clarity slider to the left. I prefer keeping it between -15 and -30. Past that, I think it can start to look a bit too obvious and artificial. It complements nicely all the work done in the highlight region of the tone curve, making the photo softer and less digital looking. What I've been doing recently is also bringing down my sharpness slider. I did not bother too much until lately, so I would keep it at 40, which is the default value most of the time, but now I like removing sharpness altogether. And if I feel like it lacks a bit of texture and sharpness somewhere, I would use some masks, so you get something that is even more intentional. Dehaze is also important, and dehaze is different than contrast because it adds contrast targeting the lower contrast areas, like the sky and some plain surfaces. It goes a bit against the concept of negative clarity, but I like to add a touch of it to wrap my images with a tiny bit more contrast without darkening even further the darker areas of a photo. But situations I use the dehaze slider more is on photos in forest. When you have this very harsh contrast scene, difficult to handle on digital, I go negative dehaze, -15, even -30, you get very nice results. You can bring back that airy, dreamy feel you probably saw in real life that did not translate in the raw file. And the last step to put the cherry on top of this organic look is grain. I typically add grain to all my photos, but at different intensity, and that is mostly dictated by the desired output. On most of my photos, excluding maybe the more abstract ones, I apply my small grain setting. It just reduces even more this harshness without making the grain too present and taking a leading role. For my YouTube videos where photos are shown bigger, this is my go-to. Then I have my small rough setting, which I'm really digging recently. It's a good blend that works nice for both larger outputs like YouTube, but also for smaller like Instagram. You perceive it very slightly, but still it doesn't take the leading role. And finally my rough grain settings that I use for more abstract photos, maybe a bit blurry or something, and when I want to really make the grain present, this is the one I go for. Before moving on to the next theme, I'd like to take a minute to talk about Squarespace, who is kindly sponsoring this video. Squarespace is the solution for my own website and running my online store. It's so easy to use and you can create a beautiful website in minutes, connect with your audience and sell anything from physical to digital products. What made me choose and stick to Squarespace is the simplicity in how it works and how you can personalize your own website, but also how it covers basically all my needs. This year I expanded my offering on my site with the launch of an online course on photo editing, and I am so happy to have everything under the same website. It's easier to manage for me and better for the students that are not jumping around between different platforms to access the course content. You don't need any coding or web design knowledge. Building a website from scratch is very easy, smooth, and even enjoyable, I would say. They also have some high quality templates, so you can begin designing your website on a solid foundation and customize it as you like to fit your style and visual identity. Squarespace is the perfect solution for both growing and established online businesses, running a blog, or simply having a portfolio presented the way you like it. You can head over to squarespace.com for a 14-day free trial, and when you're ready to launch your website, you can go to squarespace.com/Adrian to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for the support. And now we can move on to colors. We can move on to the question that revolved around colors and color grading, and now I realized that I talked a lot more than I thought on this first section and covered colors a bit already, so I will try not to repeat myself too much. Colors seems to be a big pain point for a lot of people when editing photos in Lightroom. I think a good place to start is to understand the technical aspect of things, how the software is dealing with colors. I think you can get very good results only by intuition and using the tools in no particular order, messing first with vibrance, moving to the HSL and then to the calibration tool, but what you may not see is that there is a funnel behind the panel and the sliders. For example, white balance and calibration comes before the HSL or even the RGB curves. We can look at this demonstration, again made with extreme values, so it really demonstrates my point. If we change the colors using the calibration tool, then the HSL interprets the colors based on this new set of information defined by the calibration. Sky is purple. If you move the purple and blue slider, the sky changes color. Same with the white balance. Now sky is red, orange, and we need to change the red and orange sliders to affect the sky in the HSL. But if you did extreme changes to the RGB curves, for example, the sky is red magenta, but changes to these sliders does nothing. Lightroom still thinks of the sky being blue, and the same is valid for the color grading tool. So the calibration tool and the white balance sliders are really there to reshape the colors, acting on the raw data of your files and making a new base, almost like a new color science to work with. Curves, HSL, and color grading come after. So I think that the secret to rich colors and having control over them is starting your edits with calibration and white balance, trying to get closer to the desired results with them and use the other tools to fine-tune and add style to your photos on a second stage of the process. A good trick is also to add a bunch of saturation in the calibration tool to make those colors richer that you can always tone down later in the HSL. What I usually do after is playing with the vibrance and saturation a lot, trying to find a good balance. I prefer the vibrant slider because it is smarter, it brings up the less saturated colors, while the saturation slider affects everything evenly. I like adding a bunch of vibrance, up to 40, even 50 easily, then add a touch of saturation to wrap everything if I feel I like it. But when editing from scratch and using those sliders before getting into the HSL, I might get oversaturated colors, which is intentional. It gives me a richer base that I can tone down using the HSL, targeting specific colors. And when I have a preset with already all the adjustments done in the HSL, I just have to play with the vibrance and saturation slider to find a sweet spot, if the result is not perfect from the get-go. Some of you also wanted to know about how to choose a color grade for a scene and how to dial it correctly. And I believe that a color grade, if dialed correctly, can fit any scene. For example, not every photos taken in cold and wet conditions have to be edited with cool and greenish tones. A warmer color grade can totally fit, and it will also contribute to have a consistent style across all your images. You just need the right dosage of it, and I understand that it can be hard and it comes with a lot of experience, but I would say that practically speaking, what helps me a ton is checking the before and after constantly when I edit photos. I even assigned the before-after shortcut to this button here on my mouse. I have a Swiss keyboard, so before-after is a combination of 3 different keys. And here with just one click on my mouse, I can check the before, and it is much quicker. And I think I usually do it 20, 30 times on a photo I edit from scratch. This really helps me not getting carried away and going too far in my color grades and generally speaking in my edits. I also had someone asking how I balance between natural and creative edits, and I found that quite interesting. I think I keep my edits on the natural side for most of my pictures, but from time to time I would go for a more creative edit. But this is not just a result of an impulse to edit differently. Usually it is the photo itself that calls for it. When you have a photo that is more monochromatic or analogous, you can lean into that and try to accentuate that even further in the edit. Or sometimes I have a very special composition, maybe something along the line of minimalism or abstract. This is typically when I would go away from my presets, either editing from scratch or still applying the presets as a base, but then do a lot of work on colors and masks to really develop my vision. This one is a good example. I played with the tones and the basic settings to really obliterate the darker areas, and then played with masking and HSL to separate the colors better, especially on the umbrellas in the center and on the left side. Moving on to exposure and contrast questions that I assume were more about the basic settings section. So first of all, there is no particular order you have to move your exposure and other basic sliders. It is a lot more important to respect an order between these basic settings and the tone curve. The basic settings affect the raw data and let you reshape the dynamic range of a photo, while the tone curve comes after, working on the amount of data defined by what you have done before in the basic settings. If your blacks and shadows are crushed because of the basic settings, you will not be able to recover them in the tone curve, and it's the same with the highlights region. When you understand the interaction between the basic settings and the tone curve, you will understand why it makes sense to move up your blacks and shadows in the basic settings and then bringing them down in the tone curve. And it's the same with highlights. Down in the basic settings and up in the tone curve makes absolute sense. That said, within the basic settings you can do how you prefer, but I have a workflow that I stick to most of the time. First, the most important is the exposure slider. I like to have a reference point in my image where I want the exposure to be as close as the desired result, not worrying about clipping my highlights or shadows, and then I move on to the individual sliders to rebalance and recover data where I want. When I'm dealing with very high contrast scenes, maybe something backlit or a sunset or sunrise, I like to use a mask even before the basic settings to start from a more balanced base. Otherwise you would have to push either the highlights or shadow sliders to the extreme, and these can look very bad, I think. And when I use this technique of using a mask to rebalance my exposure, I typically use the exposure slider so the result is really neutral, moving what's in the mask evenly in one direction or the other. But I don't do it all the time because contrast is life. You don't want your photos look like an iPhone shot out of the box where all the shadow and highlights are overly balanced. Then someone wondered how to make your images bright and lively, and I think it starts in camera. I try to expose as bright as possible just before losing data in the highlights. I will make a video talking about exposure and how I expose with my Sony camera, so stay tuned for that. Then in post it is mostly about keeping those highlights body high, contracting that with maybe a bit of positive white, but I would say it is also in the tone curve that a lot happens. You want to get that right half of the curve decently high if you want your images to look very bright. And then the best way to really monitor the brightness of the image you're editing is using the white backdrop. I default to this one. Although I prefer the interface with the dark gray background, it always makes me edit a bit too dark, I think. With the white backdrop, you have a brightness reference point right next to your photos at all time. With that, I also rarely feel the need of looking at the histogram to edit my images. Intuition and the white background works perfectly fine for me. Next theme is everything workflow, process, and mindset related, and here I have to be honest, with a small number of presets that I truly love and designed to be versatile, with my system I rarely edit from scratch, so I rarely face the question of where I am going with this edit. Now I apply the preset that I already know will suit the scene the best, make small adjustments to the dynamic range using either my adjustment preset or tweaking manually, which takes me very little time. Then I jump into masking if I want to push the edit further and if I feel like the photo needs it. And then I do very minor final touches like adding grain, tweaking sharpness, etc. And like I said before, the white background and the constant jumping between the before and after really help me to understand and decide where will be my endpoint. You probably heard many times photographers editing, then taking a step back for a few hours or days, and then coming back to editing that set of photos. And I rarely do that anymore, but I guess it comes with experience and with this constant jumping between the before, after, and the white background. And in the rare occasions I edit from scratch, then what I'm thinking before moving the sliders is the look I want. Do I want something warm or cold or greenish? I think about the contrast. Do I want something light and airy or dark and contrasty? And I also try to visualize the light in the photo and where maybe some masks would be required. Then I start pushing and pulling sliders. And then about references and inspiration, I think they are extremely important. For example, you don't learn a language without listening to the language. You have to hear it from people around you, in the TV or online, to have an idea of how it sounds before trying to mimic it. And it's the same with photos, both on the capturing aspect side of things and on the editing side. It's hard to tell exactly who or what were my inspirations, but try to be mindful about them. It's good to get input from different photography style, but if the photos you are looking at are all edited in drastically different ways, you may be tempted to just jump all over the place when it comes to edit your own photos. Then on a practical level, you can use the reference tool in Lightroom to have a photo you like next to the photo you're editing and try to replicate the look of it. One thing I also strongly advise in favor of is buying presets. Yes, I sell some and I would be glad if you choose to get mine, but really get some presets from the photographers you really like the editing style the most and then try to break them apart. Don't apply them and forget them. Get something in return of your investment by making some reverse engineering, trying to understand the effect of some decisions or whatever slider it may be, so you can learn and then create your own presets that match better your vision and your approach. Following up on presets, I had someone asking how to increase the number of presets you're satisfied with, and I think it starts by learning that it's much better to have 3 strong presets than 40 average ones. This will really help to dial down your style and force you to constantly improving on those presets you have. When you notice that you keep making the same changes when you applied a set preset, then it is time to update it. For example, if you always bring back the reds towards magenta, then do it once, update the preset, and then you'll get something that will work better and will require less individual tweaking going forward. Then my second tip would be to not really include the 4 basic settings, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks in the presets, or more so, leaving them at 0. Then you would have a strong base, only requiring you to tweak 4 sliders for already very good results. If a preset includes a lot of changes on these 4 sliders, it's more likely to be a one-click wonder once in a million time, and then something discouraging and that needs so much tweaking every time you apply it. And for me, presets are really at the core of getting a consistent look and a visual identity in the long term. To be more accurate and more practical, a consistent way of shaping the tone curve, the colors, and the color grading will be the things that will help you to get a consistent look across a larger body of work. You should keep the basic sliders and the white balance to recover and rebalance the raw material, and then let the rest be the DNA of your look. Also a quick note about color profiles. I have not too many cameras, but if you do and you want to ensure consistency in your work, edit your photos in any of the Adobe color profiles. These will set a similar baseline for photos from any camera model of any brand, so you can have very similar results all the time. I personally like Adobe Color the most, but you can choose any of them, but I would still advise to not changing it all the time, because you will just always have to adapt your editing approach to match this very fundamental interpretation of raw data made by Lightroom. So with all that said on presets and editing, I have to say that I never feel like a photo needs no editing at all. Now we have brands that make JPEG much better than others and you get some very good results, but every time I see them, I know that I can have something just a bit better with only simple tweaks that would take me like 5 seconds. I always feel like these straight out of camera photos are lacking either a bit of brightness, a bit of contrast, a bit of something that for now is only achievable by editing. Moving on to the next themes, which is masks. And my favorite and most used masks are still the basic ones like radial mask, which I think I use the most. And then we have the linear mask and brush that I think I use at equal frequency, I'd say. Then I often select my sky with the automatic sky detecting mask, and also regularly play with the select object mask for very precise adjustments. But my biggest advice on masks would be to be very subtle with them. When I use the radial, linear and brush, I always keep the feather at 100% to make sure that these transitions are smooth and not too obvious. And then try to be mindful with how much you change in the mask. Pushing the sliders to the extreme is never a good idea, and then the more precise the mask is, like a sky mask, a subject mask or object mask, the more subtle you need to be with your sliders to keep everything looking natural. And my last tip would be to really play a lot with the intersect, subtract and invert features to really select the desired areas, but once again, the smaller and the more accurate the selection, the more subtle the changes need to be. We are finally reaching the last theme, which is all about monitor calibration, output, sharpness and all that kind of things. And my solution to deal with colors and contrast inconsistencies between devices like my computer, my phone and my desk monitor is pretty simple, but not very cost effective. I have a full Apple ecosystem with a MacBook Pro, the Studio Display and an iPhone 16 Pro. I can justify it because photography and YouTube is my work, so whatever that makes me more excited to work and makes the whole experience smoother is worth it. I mean, of course, in a limited spectrum, because I will not put all my money and take a loan to get that sort of stuff, but I am willing to spend an extra few $100s on this now. I keep all my devices with their original color profile. My phone never turns into that true tone or warm sleep mode, and I have very consistent colors and contrast everywhere. Maybe not the solution you wanted to hear, but that's what I have. And now about how I export my photos. I used to just export in full resolution and max quality all the time. I still do it now that Instagram switched to this new 4:3 aspect ratio, but since I'm adding these white borders out of Lightroom, the resolution changes in the process. I do it with Canva, which is quite simple. You put a white background, you put your image and decide how close you want it to be to the edge, then you duplicate your page so you always keep the same margin between the photo and the edge of the white canvas. The project inside of Canva is set to 2048 pixels on the vertical edge, which is apparently the best way to suffer the least from the Instagram compression. And honestly, I don't know if it makes that huge of a difference, but why not doing it? But anyway, I think what will make your images look and feel sharp is the photo itself. If it has enough contrast, the direction of the light and how it wraps around the scene and your subjects, that's what will make a photo look sharp. And for my YouTube videos, I keep my photos in full resolution, max quality, and put them on my timeline. I zoom out a bit and put a white background under it, and that's it. And after that, I don't want to expand too much on the website output and prints because I am not an expert and I don't want to misguide you with that. So I think that's it. I covered all the themes and hopefully replied to all your questions. Thanks a lot for watching this video all the way to the end if you're still here. And yeah, see you next time.